Good day. In my previous program, I spoke about the deteriorating situation for Ukraine in Donbass, and I also said that the only way forward for Ukraine that made any kind of rational sense was for Ukraine to begin negotiations immediately and without prior conditions with the Russians to see if any kind of solution could be obtained which would at least allow some form of Ukraine to survive in something that resembles its present form. Well, there's been more military news over the course of today. It's not been dramatic, but it all points to the same conclusion, that the days of the Ukrainian military force in Donbass are now very much numbered. Firstly, it turns out it's been confirmed that the Russians have gained control of Severodonetsk airport, and that they are in fact in control, as I discussed yesterday, of all of the residential areas of the town. The other thing is that it seems that somewhere along the front lines, the Russians have now successfully crossed the Seversky Donetsk River. Now, there's been various attempts by the Russians to cross this river at various times. It's often been seen as an important strategic barrier, which has worked in favor of Ukraine. As I discussed in one of my recent programs, the change in weather conditions, the hot weather, means that the water levels of the river, which is never particularly wide, have now lowered, and it is possible for men and machines to wade across. And I should say that Russian tanks and armored vehicles are designed to be adaptable to river crossings. So this seems to be something that's happened. The Ukrainians, by the way, say that there are around 40,000 Russian troops now operating in northern Donbass, and they confirm what has been claimed in the past, that their troops in Donbass are heavily outnumbered. And they're not just outnumbered, of course, in men, they are outnumbered many times in terms of material. Well, that's the situation in northern Donbass around Severodonetsk. But there's been also grim news for Ukraine in other places. It seems that the Russian force in Izium, around the town of Izium, is now pressing south and is starting to approach Slavyansk. It's been basically standing idle for several weeks. My own personal view is that the reason that it did that was that it was mainly tasked with shielding the main Russian advance, which is from eastern Ukraine, and that the function of the Izium force was to block Ukrainian reinforcements that were heading towards northern Donbass. And in fact, there have been repeated Ukrainian attempts to try to break through into northern Donbass, and they've all been countered successfully by this major Russian force in northern Donbass around Izium. Well, there are reports that it's now been moving south, and that it is now very, very close indeed to Slavyansk, and that it's now also the case that Russian troops have been pushing further west from the town of Liman, which they captured about a week ago, and that Slavyansk, which is the northern part of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, is now also coming under severe pressure and will be surrounded fairly soon. As I discussed in my previous program, Zelensky's press spokesman Arestovich has now spoken about a siege of Slavyansk beginning very soon, and that is now clearly shaping out as one might have expected. Anyway, there's been further news elsewhere on other fronts, and that is, the first is the confirmation that Ukraine's Kherson offensive, about which we were hearing so much, has now been driven all the way back to its starting lines, that the offensive that was supposed to liberate Kherson town, city of Kherson, the single most important town, largest town that the Russians have captured since they began their operation in February, that counteroffensive has been thrown back to its starting lines after suffering very heavy losses. And now there's been further news, there's been confirmation over the last few hours, and this seems confirmed, that the Russians have now installed an S-400 anti-aircraft missile system on Snake Island. This is this contested island off Odessa, which the Ukrainians tried disastrously to recapture in the first week of May, suffering extremely heavy losses. There's been repeated talk of the Ukrainians launching another attack on Snake Island. After that attack, the Russians have garrisoned it extensively. They've installed anti-aircraft missile systems there, and now they've installed the most powerful anti-aircraft missile system of all, which is the S-400 missile system. Now, I have to say, I'm somewhat surprised about this, because Snake Island is actually a very small place. I wouldn't have thought it was big enough to house the S-400 missile system. In fact, embarrassingly, I said as much in a previous program. Well, it turns out that I was wrong, and that the Russians have somehow rather managed to install an S-400 missile system on Snake Island. Now, that, it seems to me, means that in combination with the air defences in Crimea and with the missile systems based in Crimea, especially the anti-ship missile systems that are based in Crimea, some of which are supersonic, that the Russians now have Snake Island covered, and that any Ukrainian attempt to recapture Snake Island would be at this point futile. And I suspect even the Ukrainians probably understand this. So we have seen a steady deterioration of the military situation for Ukraine across the entire arc of conflict. The Russians consolidating their gains, pressing forward towards Slavyansk, capturing Severodonetsk airport, and strengthening their air defences in Snake Island. And we've had further news which perhaps ought to make the Ukrainians particularly concerned, because we've now had a major conference in the Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense. Much of it was televised and reported, and we have a fairly good idea of what this whole Ministry of Defense discussion in Moscow was all about. And it was addressed by the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. And he spoke about the fact that the land corridor from Russia to Crimea is now complete and it is in operation. The road systems and the train lines have all been brought back into full operation, so that road and rail traffic can now move from Russia through the Donbass, through the two Donetsk republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, recognized by Russia as independent and allied to Russia, and in all respects essentially under Russian control. By the way, on that topic, the Donetsk People's Republic now has a new prime minister who is a Russian official. So that gives us some idea of how tightly controlled these two republics are by Russia. Anyway, there's now possibility of sending road and rail traffic all the way by land from Russia through Donbass, through Zaporozhie and Kherson regions, both now controlled by Russia. Kherson region entirely so, Zaporozhie region largely so, all the way to Crimea. And this has a logistical bearing, not just in terms of the future of Crimea and of the future diplomatic and political settlement of the conflict, but it also has a bearing in terms of the logistics of this military operation. Because what it now means is that the Russians can transfer many more armaments, tanks, armoured vehicles, rocket launchers, air defense systems by rail through Donbass to every part of the front line in southeastern Ukraine. And of course, this changes the logistical picture radically. It means that the Russians are able to reinforce their forces, to supply them effectively, and that, of course, is going to have important implications for the way in which the military situation works out. Now, there is, however, perhaps even more importantly, a political dimension to this. Now, in my previous program, I spoke about how it seemed to me that President Putin of Russia was leaving the door ajar for future negotiations. And he was very careful to speak of this Russian military special operation in Donbass. When he slipped out the word Ukraine, he immediately corrected himself and started talking about Donbass. And I've said that this seemed to me to be an attempt to leave the door ajar open for negotiations with Ukraine. Well, within hours of Putin's interview, we started to get clarification from anonymous Russian officials. Now, Russian officials don't usually speak anonymously, but they did it on this occasion, and they spoke principally to the Russian newspaper Izvestia, and they made it absolutely clear, they made it clear beyond any possible doubt, that in terms of any diplomatic settlement, this time Ukraine must be prepared to cede not just Donbass, not just the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics and Crimea, but also Zaporozhie region and Kherson region as well. And by Zaporozhie region, I understand that the Russians mean not just those areas in Zaporozhie region which they currently control, which in territorial terms is the greater part of Zaporozhie region, but the city of Zaporozhie, which is a major industrial centre and which is still under Ukrainian control. And these same sources, we don't know who these were, but these same sources apparently made the point that if Ukraine had negotiated on the basis of the Minsk agreement, it would have lost Crimea, but it would have retained the whole of Donbass and the only parts of Donbass which would have been subject to a special autonomous governmental system would have been the areas of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic within the ceasefire lines agreed in 2015. Now, if Ukraine had agreed in March to negotiations, Ukraine would have lost Crimea and it would have lost the entirety of Donbass. That's to say, it would have lost Donetsk and Lugansk regions. Because they didn't do that in March, because they listened to the false counsel of people like Prime Minister Boris Johnson of Britain, because they pulled out of the negotiations and clawed back all their concessions. Now, if negotiations begin anew, begin afresh, this time they will lose much more territory. They will lose Kherson region and they will lose Zaporozhie region as well. So that will create a whole belt of territory, the two regions of Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk, and also Zaporozhie and Kherson region, forming a belt of Russian control linking Russia directly to Crimea and bringing Russian forces very close to Odessa. Now, the implication of these briefings by these anonymous officials to Izvestia is that, of course, if Ukraine holds out further, if it suffers further defeats, then it will lose even more territory, and as part of every negotiation, any future negotiation, then it won't just lose, in addition to Donbass and Crimea, Kherson and Zaporozhie region, it would lose other regions as well. And of course, the great prize is the city of Odessa. The fact that the Russians have consolidated their control of Snake Island shows that they continue to be focused on Odessa, and ultimately, with all these logistical systems now established, with the railway and road links established, they can assemble very large forces close to the towns of Nikolaev and Kryvyi Rog, which basically act as a shield for Odessa, and they would be in a position very quickly to advance on Odessa itself, at which point the land corridor stretching all the way from Russia to the breakaway region of Transnistria in Moldova would be complete, and Ukraine would have entirely lost its entire coastline, and perhaps the city of Odessa, which is perhaps the most important, at least from a Russian point of view. Well, that is a disaster. That would be a disaster for Ukraine. But of course, it probably wouldn't just stop there if the Ukrainians refused to recognize the loss of Odessa, if they were to keep fighting. Well, other places would probably be lost as well. Kharkiv, where the Russians remain very much at the gates of the city. Dnipro, which the Russians still call Dnipropetrovsk. Other towns like Chernigov and Sumy. Ultimately, Kiev itself. Eventually, central Ukraine. Places like Kremenchuk, Poltava, Vinnytsia. I'm using the old pronunciations of these cities, which I've learnt from previously. I do understand that Ukrainians pronounce some of these names differently from me. I apologise in advance for that. I'm not going to pretend I haven't been able to keep up with all the various changes of name. But anyway, sooner or later, eventually, if the Ukrainians continue to hold out, the risk they run is that there will be no useful Ukraine left, no viable Ukraine left, and of course eventually there might be no Ukraine at all left. So I repeat my advice to them, the advice I gave in my previous program, that the sooner they sit down and negotiate in earnest, the better for them it would be. Now, alongside all this crisis, this crisis situation that we're seeing in eastern Ukraine, alongside the news of the railway bridge, we had this defiant comments from President Zelensky. He again said that Ukraine would not accept a stalemate situation, that it would insist on total victory, that it would insist on recovery of all its lost lands. This, even as President Zelensky himself admits that the Ukrainians would need to outnumber the Russians 10-1 in order to defeat the Russians in recovering all these lost lands. And of course 10-1 in men. I mean, the amount of material Ukraine would need in order to defeat the Russians in that way, well, it's not even calculable, in my opinion. I doubt, to be straightforward about it, whether even NATO has that level of military power in order to achieve that kind of reconquest. So it is fantasies. And I'm afraid the sooner Ukraine drops all these fantasies, starts thinking seriously about its military options, the better for Ukraine it will be. Now, alongside all of that, we learned that there's been more discussions between Ukraine, Russia and Turkey, or Türkiye, as we must now apparently call it. That's apparently a demand from the Turkish authorities that, they're insisting that everybody must now in future refer to their country as Türkiye, not as Turkey, something which, by the way, the Russians have interpreted as a further sign that Turkey, or Türkiye, is now distancing itself from the West I'll put discussion of that to one side for the moment. But anyway, there's been discussions between the Turkish authorities, the Ukrainian authorities, and the Russian authorities about unblocking Ukrainian ports so that Ukrainian grain ships can start to leave these ports, by which of course we mean Odessa. And the Turkish authorities offered to carry out a demining operation in Odessa. The Russians said that they wouldn't interfere. And of course, as soon as these proposals were put forward, Ukraine went back on what it had promised before. It apparently said that there's no question of demining in Odessa, that this would take months to do, that it might expose Odessa to attack by the Russians. Ukraine is not prepared to agree to this. So it seems to me that this idea of opening up Odessa for grain ships has failed, and to be very clear, it's the Ukrainians who have made that decision. Well, there we are. It seems to me that we have a situation where, in my opinion, the major military battle, it's not quite over yet. There's still heavy, big fighting to do in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. There's no doubt the completion of the military operation, the Russian military operation in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk to carry out. But we are now, I think, within sight of its end, the major battle in Donbass. And I have to say that with all of these events that we've now heard about, I am far from convinced that once the battle in Donbass is ended, Ukraine will have any more military cards left to play. The expectations, the beliefs, the hopes some people have, the fears many people had that Ukraine was going to build up a huge army in western and central Ukraine and deploy it to the east, launch counteroffensives in August. I don't think anybody takes that seriously anymore. Zelensky's comments about Ukraine needing a 10-to-1 advantage in order to drive back the Russians. Well, that basically, it seems to me, ends any idea of a counteroffensive. It's a way for, it's intended, presumably, to prepare the Ukrainian people for the fact that that counteroffensive is never going to happen. So, given that this is so, given that, as I said, there's not a military build-up by Ukraine in central and western Ukraine, given that the western arms supplies to Ukraine are proving, frankly, far more limited, perhaps, than Ukraine had hoped, given that the best part of the Ukrainian army is now almost destroyed in eastern Ukraine, I strongly suspect that within the next few weeks, the major part of the war, the actual fighting war, will be over. At that point, it will be, as far as the Russians are concerned, well, I'm not going to say mopping up, because there might still be some serious fighting to do. But anyway, they will be in a position with the main part of the Ukrainian army defeated and destroyed. It will be the Russians, as I said, who will be in a position either to dictate terms or to advance as far west as they choose. So I don't think Ukraine has much of a window left if it's going to start serious negotiations and if it's going to search or reach out for a diplomatic settlement. Henry Kissinger at Davos about 2 weeks ago spoke about Ukraine having 2 months, the Western powers having about 2 months before the window closes. He didn't quite put it in the way that I have said, but that's what it amounts to. I think 2 months is about right. I think that unless Ukraine settles and negotiates and comes to a agreement with Russia within the next 2 months, before the end of August, then I'm afraid the question will no longer be decided either on the battlefield or on the negotiation table, but in the Kremlin by Putin and his senior officials. Well, that's the way things look for me today. I'll obviously be giving you further updates. Again, apologies if the light is not perhaps as good as it's been in other places and when I'm in London. But anyway, I've given you my views today. Thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can check us out on Rumble and Locals and on other platforms like SuperU and ODYSEE. And also you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by also remember that you can check out our shop and buy the various things that you will find there. Our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all those great things. And thank you, as I said again, for joining me today. More from me soon. And if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel.